Welcome back to Appetite TV. John Carhill here. I'm going to take you through a bit of a chat around the caster's worst nightmare, wind knots. It's a horrible rainy day in Victoria today, so no fishing. It's a good time to be in the garage doing a little bit of filming, and I have literally been asked this specific question a few times. I know that's the YouTuber's greatest bullshit line. I'm getting lots of questions about this just as an excuse to make a video. This is actually genuine. I've been asked this a fair bit, and I feel pretty qualified to talk about wind knots because I've had so many of them. I was plagued by them in my early heavy casting career, I guess, and there were just some key mistakes that I was making, and I've learned it the hard way. Wind knots really can stuff around a day's fishing. They cost you gear, they cost you fish, and they cost you fishing time. Understand what causes them, learn how to manage them, and you will have a much smaller incidence of them, and you're going to catch more fish. More time, lure in the water, gear will be stronger because wind knots actually weaken the line, and end of the day, more fish in the boat, more pleasure. So stay with us as we go through Wind Knot 101. I guess the first thing is, what is a wind knot? You don't have to have wind to get one either, by the way. Wind knot is where line comes off the spool of a spinning reel in such a fashion that it will either grab other loops of line that aren't in the correct order. So it's the top coils coming off the reel are grabbing coils that are loose that are lower down on the reel. Essentially, it all comes down to line that is actually loose on the spool. Now, if you ever watch some slow-mo footage of a cast, and I hope to put some footage in right here so you can see it for yourself, line comes off the spool of a spinning reel in great big loops as it comes off and goes into the stripper guide. The stripper guide being the first guide on your casting rod, where it is all constricted down and channeled, and it starts to get smaller and smaller as it goes out towards the rod tip. But between the spool and that stripper guide, you get some horrendous big loops, and if there's loose line on the reel, it will grab those loops. It'll start to tangle even before it gets to the stripper guide. Sometimes you'll get actually hang-ups on the stripper guide itself. Sometimes in GT fishing, throwing really big lures, you can actually get such forces that if you get a guide wrap caused by a wind knot on your stripper guide, it can actually flatten them, bend them flat, or even rip them completely off the rod. I've had that happen. And guys that cast harder than me probably have it more often. So you've got line coming off the spool either faster than it can handle, or with loose line underneath that it's grabbing and taking with it. There are a couple of really key factors to keep your line managed on the spool to avoid that happening. The first and foremost, and I reckon the number one cause of wind knots, is by line being overfilled on the spool. We get our new line, get our new reel, and we want to pack as much line on it as possible because we're ready to tackle big fish. We want that line full so we can do really big long casts and have heaps of line for big long runs. It is 100% the biggest mistake that you can make. My approach to it nowadays is to actually slightly underfill my spools, but to spool them really, really tight. Pack it down hard, because over time, our line will actually get looser as we use it. We won't be able to pack it on quite as tight. And if we underfill it, then as it loosens, it'll actually get to near optimum filling. And that is roughly, for me, around 1 millimeter below the flat diameter faces of the front lip of the spool. Overfill it, you are going to get wind knots. I will absolutely guarantee it. The other factor in terms of actual spooling up is these little gadgets that we get when we buy a reel. Hopefully that focuses on that. Yeah, there it is there. These are washers that adjust our spool height. Don't throw them away, hang on to them, put them in a safe place. I keep all mine together in just one reel box for all the different reels that I use, and save them for a rainy day. Usually the problem will appear in the first instance when you're spooling a reel up for the first time. You'll be winding line on nice and tight using a reel spooler like the really good busted one. Strongly recommend that. Yes, we sell it at Ed Tide, but Frank Firkin from Busted Fishing has made a sensational product there. It's gone all around the world. There's other spoolers. You can use your shop spoolers, which are good in the right hands. Not just anyone can use one of those. You need to know what you're doing to get even line lay. Not just the finished product, but each stage of filling that line. There are other spoolers out there. I can't vouch for them personally. But back on subject, you want your spool to fill with line and for the line to be nice and even across the spool. What you very often see will be situations where at the back of the spool is not even in line lay to the front of the spool, and you might get bunching at the front or the other way around, bunching at the back, and it might look like this. Line, I'm exaggerating here, line packed high here and all bunching up on each other, and here the spool looks even a little bit empty, and you can get it the other way around too. Now I've recently spooled this Stella 18,000 spool with Tasline, and hopefully you can see that, and hopefully it's focusing on it. It is actually two things. It appears overfilled at the front here. It's actually not overfilled, but it appears that way because there is more line stacked towards the front than there is towards the back. It's actually a really classic case of the stacking washers not being correct. To fix this, it's a bit of a pain in the butt, but it's quite simple. I'll strip this line off the spool onto another spool, and I will add one of these washers and then go through the process of spooling it up tight again and hopefully getting a nice even line lay. And I'll do that at the end of this video and show you what I mean. I think the amount of line on this is right. It's just laid incorrectly in that it's all stacked towards the front half of the spool. So that's another way we often see wind knots, by the line being stacked. Either way, I think the worst is actually that way, where it's stacked towards the front. Line coming off the spool from the back tends to really catch the thicker lip of the line on the front edge, and it's wind knot city. What else? When you're on the water, is that there are a number of things that you can do, mistakes that you can make that will, even if you've got your gear right, you've got quality line. I use the word quality here with emphasis. Cheap, nasty lines, stiff lines, like really kind of ropey lines that have got almost an abrasive quality to them are worse for wind knots. You want a slick, smooth line, and that is actually where some of these coatings are quite important. Sometimes quite old line can become prone to wind knots because it gets, the coating wears off essentially, and it becomes a lot rougher, and it grips the line as it comes off other loops as it goes. But on the water, wind knots, the name wind knots, there's a bit of a clue there about how they will often happen, and that is casting into the wind. We can't always position our boat or go to the shoreline so that we've got a nice downwind cast. Trust me, I like them. They make me look good. They make me look like I'm a really strong caster, but situation sometimes is that just can't happen. So casting into the wind is the situation where, the way I like to think about it is, your lure leaves the rod tip, you know, with that whatever hang back you've got on your leader, it leaves at whatever speed. Let's just say, for example, I'm going to make a number up, 100 kilometers an hour. And it's coming off the spool with that same inertia because it's being dictated by the initial speed of the lure flying through the air. What you find though, casting into the wind, two things happen. One is the lure will slow down very fast. That initial speed as it flies off your rod tip will reduce fast as it goes into the wind. You'll notice that your casts aren't anywhere near as long casting that way. But your spool speed, the rate at which it's ripping off the spool, stays relatively the same. It's just that initial inertia has created loops of line coming off, and it doesn't slow down as fast as the lure does. So you've kind of got more line coming off the spool than the system can handle. And it's really, really common to get wind knots caused by that. On the flip side, I said that there were two things about wind. The other one is, you often end up, despite your best efforts of being really punchy with your cast, like you do appreciate that you're not going to cast as far, so you try to cast flatter and with more punch. That will actually help reduce the amount of loop in the line. If we're going for the same cast, the same trajectory that you would use if you were casting downwind, you will end up with a cast that balloons out, sits, and almost feels like, sometimes if the wind's strong, almost feels like at the end that it blows back towards you. And you'll end up with a big significant loop of line. How you manage that loose line is really important. If we were casting downwind, there'd be only a small amount of loose line that we've got to get on the reel, but into the wind we've got this big loop of line that we need to get back on tight. I recommend literally doing things like this. Making sure you close that bail arm. Don't just wind it closed for reels that have the auto close feature. Close the bail arm, seat the line in the roller, and if necessary, even hold the rod in your hand and pinch the line as you wind it on to get it on to the point where you're in contact with your lure. This is in extreme cases I'm talking about here, but if you've got a big line lay that's loose, you need to control it to get it back on the spool, at least semi-tight. If you are just winding on loose line, you are somewhere between 5 and 10 casts away from a wind knot, I almost guarantee it. So you've got to manage that line. You can't avoid casting into it, right? Now, another factor that we can control is when we're sweeping lures, or we're walking the dog, or we're twitching a lure, we often inadvertently create loose line loops by how we manage that. You've really got to be aware of it. You've got to be looking at your spool and judging whether your line is on tight, and every now and again do a gentle cast downwind and just crank that lure back in to get the line back on tight. And I say gently because I almost guarantee you, if you've been doing a lot of sweeping and not managing the line, the loose line after you sweep, you know, you pull the lure through and then you wind it back up. If it's just loose, you're not far off an issue. So if you've got this, you know, you think you've got some loose line, just flick it gently. Don't flick it too far initially, because downwind, bit of speed up, all of a sudden it'll catch a loop and you'll have a wind knot. So just do that gently, get it on tight. Then you might be able to do a long one, get it on tight. Then you're right to go again. You're right to go back to working your lure, with your walk the dog, with your twitch and pause, or with your sweep, whatever you're doing, short stabs. So that's another factor where you've got to manage line properly. Another factor that will cause you wind knots is really long, heavy leaders. I do like to run a long leader. I like to almost have, talking say, you know, GT fishing, tuna fishing, kingfish, all that kind of heavier topwater fishing. Reef flats fishing, I almost like to have the leader knot almost down to my finger on the reel, just above it. I used to have it a wrap or two on the spool. Too many issues with that for my money. I like to have it just shy of my finger, with my finger actually on the braid. But with all that leader material going through the guides and your knot, you can get quite minute. I don't know how you'd measure it, but I believe you get quite minute slowing, very slight slowing of the speed of the lure by virtue of that leader material going through your guides and the leader knot clunking. That's where things like a double uni, learn how to tie an FG or a PR, whatever your poison is, have less friction essentially going through the guides. You'll have less wind knots. If you're so inclined, a leader outside of the rod tip is probably the best practice in terms of reducing your incidence of wind knots. However, for mine, it's a little bit short. I like to have a bit of leader material for a number of reasons, for both managing the fish boat side, for leadering it, abrasion resistance on the bottom structure, and also that more natural presentation of a longer leader for line shy fish. But yeah, best practice would actually be to have that leader knot outside. For mine, I have it just above my casting finger, but just be aware, it's also a factor in the causation of wing knots. As I said at the start of the video, all these management practices won't eliminate wind knots completely. It will significantly reduce the incidence of them, but you're still going to get the odd one. Be really aware of them. You'll feel sometimes a cast go out and you'll feel something through the guides, and it's almost, sometimes when they're small, it's almost impossible to, well, not impossible, it's difficult to pick up unless you're used to it. You'll go, oh, that didn't quite feel right. You need to basically inspect the line on the way back in. Wind it back in with it basically through your fingers, because sometimes wind knots won't be great big loops of line. We're used to those horrible bird nesty looking clumps that you do get really commonly. But sometimes a wind knot can literally be what looks to be a singular knot in the line, like a granny knot. It won't be a granny knot, it'll be a loop that's tied around itself and pulled down very tight. You need to fix every one of those before you fire another cast. Each cast will make those get tighter. Each one of those in your line will actually cause more wind knots to occur. And trust me, I know from experience, they will cost you fish. You'll get the big hook up and now your braid is not at the 100% breaking strength that it once was. That knot is now the weak point and it will let you down. In fixing wind knots as they occur, what I tend to do is try and get my lure somehow out the back of the boat so it's floating down current whilst everyone can keep fishing. Go to the back of the boat and sort it out with it out the back. You can't do that with a sinking lure. Do that with a sinking lure, something like a Siren Deep Seductress. If you're over a reef especially, it's going to get to the bottom and you are going to get snagged. The other thing to be very aware of is a fish may grab your lure, floating or sinking, and you're dealing with loops of line. And if your finger is in one of those loops of line, you could get a very nasty situation where you are part of the hookup to a fish and you might end up in a degloving situation. So probably the safest way is to get your lure in the boat, strip the line through and manage it as you work through to get that knot in the line, the wind knot, or that small, very, very small knot in the line out. I'll make another video down the track, probably on the water, on how I actually manage getting wind knots out of the line. Number one thing is patience. Don't pull it tight, but we'll come to that later. Guys, hope this has helped. Learning how to manage wind knots will greatly increase your fishing pleasure and it'll put more fish on the deck. Hope you enjoyed it. Good luck.